Good day, friends, fellow citizens of this fair city of Williamsburg, and what a marvelous time it is to be in this city, the city in which I have lived for the past 18 years of my life. You know, as I was walking here, the birds were chirping, flowers were in bloom, there was that lovely light green tint still upon the leaves of spring, and I saw not one, not two, but three lovely couples gazing ever so longly into each and the other's eyes. It seemed that their charms were working. Friends, I apologize for my stutter. It has been said of me that I have a bit of a stutter, for which I apologize. I am no Patrick Henry. You're welcome. You know, when I married my wife, the weather was not half as good. We married in 1772, in the winter of 72, January 1, and there was the terrible snowstorm. Do you recall the snowstorm of 72? The snow drifts, I write, were 6 feet high. We married at her father's plantation, called the Forest. It sits in the forest. It's a very creative name, that one. And then we spent our honeymoon, you know, that time wherein you extend your love to your spouse. We spent our honeymoon at the Forest with my in-laws. That's a true delight, a true delight, friends. I recommend it. If you're in the office of marriage, then spend your honeymoon with your in-laws. And when the snow began to fall, there was a decision to be made. You know, do we wait for the spring thaw, another 2 weeks, 2 months, or do we brave it? Well, friends, we absolutely braved it and tried to drive our carriage through 6 feet of snow. Let me save you the trouble. It does not work. We lost our carriage, finished the rest of the journey on horseback, achieving the summit of that mountain very late in the evening. I shouldered open the cold, frozen door to my honeymoon cottage. My wife perused my effects. Didn't take her very long. And there she found a half-empty bottle of wine. We should probably stop the story there, but let us simply say that the next Christmas, there were 3 of us celebrating that Christmas. I do not wish to just speak of love, though, in the spring season, for spring brings in the city of Williamsburg legislative assemblies. The courts are in session, and right now our legislative assembly is doing one of the greatest tasks that man might create, and that is an establishment of a new system of code, of law. I'm on a committee of 5, well, there once was 5, and our job was to revise the entire legal code in Virginia. The committee is now just 2. One man passed away. One man considered himself too sick to carry on. That's George Mason. One man got called home on domestic business. That's Edmund Pendleton, leaving just 2 friends, the duo, George Wythe and myself, the old master and the young upstart, revising the entire legal system in Virginia. We put forth 126 new bills, friends, new bills which change and promote a new sense of equality, equitability under Republican ideals in this state of Virginia. 126 bills, and we shall go through them now. Most of my jokes are for myself, friends. Nay, we shall just go through 2 which I believe exemplify this great progressive movement forward. They are so numbered in the batch of 126. Bill number 51 and Bill number 79. Bill number 51 does away with the slave trade in Virginia. It is time. It is right. We said in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. And yet how can we, as a new and free society, hold that ideal of equality in one hand and yet continue to hold the lash of slavery in the other? It does not work. It is irresponsible and hypocritical, friends. If we do, then we begin on a lie. So let us begin with truth. Let us do away with the abhorrent slave trade in Virginia. This bill begins that process. And what better way to continue that process than by Bill 79? That's an excellent segue, Mr. Jefferson. Oh, you're welcome very much. Bill number 79. My bill for the more general diffusion of knowledge. Well, what does that sound like, friends, but publicly funded education at the state's expense? No longer will men be allowed access to an education only if they have an allowance of means, of finances. I was afforded an education when I was young because my father could afford an education. But this does disservice to the greater population of Virginia. The next Bacon, the next Newton, the next John Locke, well, they might be out there upon our beautiful rolling hills. They might not have the funds for an education. But wouldn't we all benefit from the next Newton, the next Bacon? I say yes. And so the state shall pay for your education. And here's the radical, audacious point, friends. This Bill 79 doesn't just apply to the male, but also, gasp, the female. I am a radical. Or perhaps not at all. Perhaps we see, as education is a right, that right should be applied equitably across all sexes, across income categories. No matter how much money you make or do not make, this state of Virginia will pay for your education, friends. I could go on all day through these 126 bills, but rather I wish to turn the conversation over to you and to a dear friend of mine. I've known him all my life. And with that being said, I shall, in proper parliamentary procedure, turn the conversation and cede the floor to you, friends. Until we meet again, I am ever your humble and most obedient servant, Thomas Jefferson. Good afternoon, friends and citizens. Welcome to the spring of 2020. We are coming to you live from the Capitol building at Colonial Williamsburg. The Capitol building, of course, was the capital of Virginia during our colonial history and equally during the first portion of statehood. Friends, we have an opportunity not just to talk to you about Thomas Jefferson, of which I have the honor and pleasure of portraying 40 hours a week for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, but clearly I don't have my wig or my hat on. I'm coming to you not as Thomas Jefferson, but rather Curt Smith. As I said, I portray Thomas Jefferson for the Foundation 40 hours a week. I am a first-person interpreter. The craft of interpreting is, the topic of today. In fact, I want to turn the conversation over to you in a bit, and we can talk about all things that are interpretive in nature, how the Foundation goes about interpreting, how you as Curt go about interpreting Thomas Jefferson, what is the craft, and how do we take a primary source and bring it to the life and breath on stage live to you. But before we get there, first I want to touch briefly on interpreting. Colonial Williamsburg is the world's largest living history museum, which means you see, when you come here, a lot of people dressed in fine-looking clothes with funny hats and buckle shoes, using sometimes long words in Greek and Latin. But this all has a basis and a foundation in history. The most important aspect of interpreting is to, first and foremost, get the history right, get the facts right. After that, we can begin to spin those facts into a narrative. We place them together. This is the work of a playwright. We place them together to create programs that are engaging, they're provocative, they evoke something from you. They take the audience on a journey, and we use the classic narrative structure. We go, there's a beginning, middle, and end. There's rising action, a climax. There's conflict, of course. We end in some sort of resolution. And after we have taken primary source and done our months of research, crafting that into a play, a program is the phraseology that we use, then we rehearse it. We put it up on its feet and see what sticks, see what needs to change, and finally, when we're finished with all these steps, we present it to you. Now, it should be mentioned here that I am a first-person interpreter, which means I interpret in the first person. I portray one person, that's Thomas Jefferson. I have colleagues who portray upwards of 10 people. I only have to keep one man in my head, so I have the easy part. But my script remains the same script as any first-person interpreter, and that is the history. We utilize primary source. And for me, that means we have 50,000 letters written to and from Jefferson, and that's my script. That's what we use to craft this thing. But there are other types of interpreting and other types of interpreters, not just first person. The National Park Service and NAI, the National Association of Interpretation, does a great job of laying out parameters, guidelines, and best practices for interpreting not in character, but rather a source, a feather, a quill, a wig, a geode down to a document, the Declaration of Independence. You can stay out of character and interpret a source or a site like house museums and Colonial Williamsburg do every day. So, with that being said, I'm excited, as Kurt Smith, who portrays Thomas Jefferson, to turn the conversation over to you. What questions might you have? We'll type them in the comments below, and we'll see if we can get to as many questions as possible. So, Cash is my friend here off camera, and he is going to present questions as they come in, and I will answer them as best as I can.
Our first question is from Kimberly. It's a wonderful way to start the conversation. She asks, how did you become interested in becoming an interpreter?
Kimberly, well, there's no one one pathway into this thing. The staff at Colonial Williamsburg has people who've come to this with history backgrounds, with acting backgrounds, as a retirement job. So the path that I took is not abnormal, and it's not the only way. But I come to this from an actor's background. I have an undergraduate degree in acting, a master's degree in acting. I taught college for a little bit of time, worked in New York City for several years as an actor, and then this job kind of came across my desk, and I thought it sounded pretty interesting to be able to not just memorize a 50-page script, but rather have 50,000 letters at your disposal and begin to create and craft narrative around that. That seemed absolutely fascinating. As an actor, you're pretty lucky if you have a gig that lasts more than a couple of months. So the opportunity to grow right alongside the person that I portray also was vastly interesting. I can, for example, today's the 28th of May, I can look back when Thomas Jefferson on the 28th of May was the same age that I was, and I can read exactly what he was writing on that day when he was my age. I can go into his accounts and do the exact same thing and know exactly what he was spending money on the same 28th day of May when he was the age that I am. That in itself gives me goosebumps still. Secondly, I thought it was supremely interesting that I could steep myself in this guy for so long. It's not a 1-month rehearsal process and the show goes up for another month, and after 2 months you moved on to something else. I can steep myself in this guy and really begin to understand him on a level that is so supremely rare in the world of acting. So I came to it from acting, and I have a pretty large script, and the creative side of me is very happy. And my dad is happy that I have an acting degree, but I also have a 401k.
Our next question comes from Ray, who inquires, what sources do you use for interpreting and preparing for your part as Thomas Jefferson?
Greg? Is that right? Greg?
Ray.
Oh, Ray. So Ray, there's a load of, in fact, I have some material here. So one of my first go-to sources always, I hope you can get this, but is the Papers of Thomas Jefferson. This is volume 1. There are 40-some-odd volumes being created right now for the Papers of Thomas Jefferson. These are his letters that he wrote, his projects that he worked on, spanning the very first letter that we have to the last letter that he wrote. The Princeton University started a project in 1950, and their job was to compile and annotate all of Jefferson's letters. They started in 1950, and in this year of 2020, they're still working on it. They hope to be finished with the Papers of Thomas Jefferson by the 250th of this nation, so they have a few years left. Monticello has actually started working from the back end, and they're gonna meet in the middle with one golden spike, I suppose. So the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, that's my Bible. It is primary source, and that's what I use, number 1. Number 2, oh, did Dumas Malone not make it in? What a travesty. So Dumas Malone is a Jefferson biographer. He wrote 6 volumes on Jefferson, and I highly recommend them if you're interested in taking a deeper dive. That, of course, is not primary source, but he sources his stuff very well. Additionally, I can go to other primary sources that Jefferson would know, like John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. Jefferson references this, of course, in the Declaration of Independence. He was an influential philosopher in his own right, but of course, very influential in Jefferson's right. So it's not just about what Jefferson wrote in the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, it's also about what Jefferson read. from Jean-Jacques Rousseau to Montesquieu to John Locke to Spinoza to even newspapers of the time. These are things that he would just know by being a subscriber to the Virginia Gazette. So that's another great primary source. And if you want secondary sources, there's loads of those. Of course, much has been written about Jefferson, much has been written about the 18th century, and you can get everything from well-respected and well-sourced philosophy to science of the 18th century. And if you want a good Jefferson biography, I always point people to John Meacham's The Art of Power. That, of course, again, is not primary source, but if you want to take a first dive into a life-to-death, one-volume of Jefferson, that's a pretty good one.
Our next question comes from Violet, one of our younger viewers today. She asks, how are you and Thomas Jefferson alike and not alike? How hard is it for you to portray Thomas Jefferson?
Violet. That's the actor's work, isn't it? One of the great questions you can ask yourself when taking on any role is, what part of this character resonates with me? What part is me, and where do I connect with this character? And usually then from that connection you can begin to connect with the parts that maybe don't resonate with you. I will say early on in my research of Thomas Jefferson, I began to resonate pretty profoundly with Thomas Jefferson. He is hesitant to speak publicly. I tend to be kind of a hermit. He loves his books. Well, so do I. I'd much prefer on a day like today, it's raining in Virginia, to be snuggled up on my couch with a good book than to be out somewhere socializing. Jefferson had a hesitancy to present himself publicly. That fits with me as well, and yet here I am working publicly 40 hours a week. It's a very strange thing. Jefferson also was very curious. Boy, was the guy curious. There's someone writes they meet Jefferson in a tavern, and this woman says, when we were talking, she didn't know who he was, and she says, when we were talking about the law, I felt certain he was an attorney. When conversation turned to religion, I felt certain that he was a man of the cloth, a preacher of some sort. And then when conversation turned to medicine, I thought, no, that man is a doctor. And only later, after their conversation, she asked the innkeep who he was, and the innkeep said, well, don't you know, that's Mr. Thomas Jefferson. So he was a very curious fellow, and I tend to be also a very curious fellow. He has an interest in natural philosophy that has a deep place in my heart. That was my first almost degree, was in biology. And where we differ, well, of course, times change, and science has changed. Our understanding of the world around us has changed. So there are some philosophies that are held by Thomas Jefferson that are quantifiably, verifiably false today, but at the time that was known, verified fact, cutting-edge science. So of course we differ on some of those philosophies, and slavery being one of them. He had a kind of a bicameral understanding of the thing. He wanted to get rid of it, but how did he do it? How do we do it? He was wrestling with the issue as well. It's not just a moral, simple problem for him. That's a great question, Violet, and the perfect first question for any character you ever want to portray. How are we alike? How are we different?
We have a question from Kate. She asks, what is your thought process for capturing Jefferson's gestures and mannerisms?
Oh, that's fantastic. So the cool thing is, Kate, I don't have to just create the thing. We have primary source material for how a gentleman would stand, how a gentleman would interact, not just gentlemen, but the female as well. The deportment is a very big thing in the 18th century. And if you're born into a certain class, the gentry class, for example, there's an expectation on how you behave. Not just how you behave, but what you talk about, what you don't talk about, how you move, is moving too much, how do you stand where your feet are, and of course, what clothes you wear. So in some ways, I don't have to think about it at all. All I have to do is read it and then take it on myself. Now, that's in general for the gentry class, which Jefferson was a part of, but if you want to dig down specifically to how Jefferson might have done these things, well then, what better source than primary source? We have people that write about basically Jefferson's deportment. One time someone writes about in meetings of state, so we're sitting here in the House of Burgesses right now in the Capitol building. This is where Jefferson would have met with all of the other Burgessmen in the lead up to independence and, of course, after independence. And people write about in state meetings, Jefferson would sit or stand in the corner with his arms crossed and say not a word. Well, that's great insight, isn't it? So sometimes when I'm talking as Jefferson, I'll try not to hit the mic, I will talk with my arms crossed. And that even a simple act like that may seem mundane, or it might even seem to a modern audience wrong, that why would a gentleman stand with his arms crossed? But I'm actually utilizing primary source to give credence to the fact that I am now standing here, sitting here, with my arms crossed. It's very cool. And then there are other things like spoken about Jefferson's stutter, or perhaps slight stutter. So when I portray Jefferson, I layer it in ever so slightly. Things like that help give me and maybe you a more accurate, hopefully, flavor and presentation, interpretation of Thomas Jefferson the man. That's a fantastic question as well.
Walinda asks, how long did it take for you to perfect your ability to become Thomas Jefferson?
Well, Linda, you know what word I'm going to hit first, and that's perfect. Just as this union is becoming more perfect over time, creating a more perfect union, I am hopefully, through research, creating a more perfect or a more accurate Thomas Jefferson. When I first signed on to Colonial Williamsburg, I moved here, as I said, from New York City, and the foundation here gave me 6 months of study. They said you could go to the library. They set up a cubicle there for me. It was my study carrel, and I would spend 8 hours a day reading. And the more I read, the more I perfected my understanding of Thomas Jefferson. It's a journey, Walinda. It's not over. I will continue to grow in this thing, and I will continue to find new sources and new information that change my interpretation. This is exactly what we were talking about in the beginning, how I get to steep in this character and grow along with it. As I find new information, sometimes that even changes what I said, and I find that what I have been saying for 3 years now is actually wrong. It's not an easy thing to accept, but it's the right thing to accept. Thanks, Walinda. Growing.
Our next question comes from John, who asks, if you weren't portraying Thomas Jefferson for Colonial Williamsburg, is there any other person in history you would love to portray, assuming your colleagues might have to give up a character, perhaps?
Oh, you mean in the 18th century?
Or any other point in history.
Okay, so this is very strange, and don't fault me here, but I'm going to be honest with you. I would love someday to portray, and I'd have to get some age on me now, but I'd love someday to portray in some biopic George Carlin, which is definitely a swing 180 degrees from Thomas Jefferson. In terms of history, I have a colleague who portrays Roosevelt quite well, and I'm enamored with that guy. I think portraying him would be quite fun as well.
Had another question from Andrew here, who asks, what primary and secondary sources do you rely upon for your interpretation of Jefferson? When it comes to secondary sources, do you have a particular set of books that you find useful? And how do you change your interpretation as new scholarship emerges?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? We're always digging deeper, and we're always reading and creating the best interpretation we can. So for secondary sources, I sort of divided these up into primary and secondary. There's a primary source up here as well that I didn't talk about, but this is Jefferson's memorandum books. And these are his daily accounts. These are fascinating as well. There's a couple volumes of these guys. But secondary source, it depends on what subject you want to study. Right here we have the dream of the Enlightenment. It's the rise of modern philosophy. So, of course, this is a subject that Jefferson would know like the back of his hand. And this is a great read. If you want to read about the foundation of this government, and its ancient ties to ancient governments, this is a great read. Greeks and Romans bearing gifts. This author wrote another book that I can't think of right now, but it's also worth your time. This is an experiment, this government, but it's not a brand new top to bottom thing. They pulled a lot from Greeks and Romans. If you want to read about Jefferson in his early life, I'm not going to show you the title because you can't read it, but this is called Thomas Jefferson Lawyer. This is a time that most people don't write about, when Thomas was a lawyer here in this city in Williamsburg for 7 years. So it runs the gamut. I have books specifically tying into science. There's a great book called Science and the Founding Fathers. That's fantastic. I believe that one's broken up by characters. There's a Jefferson set of chapters, a Franklin set of chapters, etc. Madison, I believe, is in there as well. So if you're going to primary source, the first thing that I do is open up table of contents. Does it have the content that you're wanting? And if it does, great. Go to the second step, and that's open up the back, the citations and the sources. Do they cite their source? If the book is thick and the citations are thin, it's going to be hard to do this. It's going to be hard to interpret and portray facts because you can't be sure where this author is getting their facts. But if it's well-sourced, that means they have hopefully checked it, and you can always double back and double-check their original sources as well. Once it fits those two sieves, it falls through, then it's probably worth your time to read. Yeah, it's a fantastic question.
I had a question from Bethany. She asked, do you ever have difficulty portraying the more controversial sides of Jefferson and voicing his opinions that you may not personally agree with?
Yeah, Bethany, I mean, the answer is yes. It's not easy to, for example, I have a program, when we're open, I have a program that runs with Jefferson's manservant Jupiter. And in that program, I stand across a dear friend and colleague of mine whose name is Jamar. And I have to say some things to Jamar that Jefferson writes in Notes in the State of Virginia, for example, and he has to take it. And these aren't things that Kurt agrees with, not at all. But I do a disservice to history and Jefferson if I only present the brilliant, beautiful parts of him. So it's not always easy. But just because a conversation is difficult and creates unease in us doesn't mean we shouldn't have the conversation. In fact, it's probably the inverse. If a conversation is difficult, if a topic is difficult to talk about, that's probably the exact topic we should be talking about. One of the cool things that the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation does is they allow us, they demand that we present material full open, warts and all. I, Kurt, don't always agree with Jefferson, but you came here to hear Jefferson, so it's my job to portray him. In Notes in the State of Virginia, he says some things that are not easy to read. In fact, I'll tell you this, Bethany, when I first read Notes in the State of Virginia and I got to chapter 14, I was so upset, I was so angry that I had to put the book down, and I couldn't read it for months. And finally, in a conversation with my mentor and friend, Bill Barker, he encouraged me to pick it back up. And so I did, and I reread that chapter, and I've probably read that chapter, I don't know, a dozen times. It's still not easy, but I come to a new understanding of Jefferson and how important it is to, even with this man who is sometimes flawed and hypocritical, to portray all of him. And that's one of the cool things. I'll end with this. It's a great question. There's an early Jefferson biographer whose name is Parton. And Parton says that, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, if America is right, Jefferson was right. And everything that's wrong with America was wrong with Jefferson, or what is wrong with America is wrong with Jefferson. That's a pretty great wrap-up. So I get to portray 40 hours a week a mirror to our society. I get to hold myself up and say, this is who we are. Do we like this? I get to talk about all of the things that are beautiful and all of the things that are flawed and wrong about this country. I hope that's not too much navel-gazing, but I think it's a pretty noble, pretty righteous, maybe, position.
We have a question from Michelle who asks, what do you do if you have a guest who asks a question of Jefferson that is not an answer that either you know or that he would know?
Yeah, Michelle, so, we have to remember that our people that we portray don't always know everything. If Jefferson were here right now, through the magic of, cryogenesis or something, DNA, then we could ask him everything. But you know what? Jefferson wouldn't always have the answer. So we have to give ourselves a bit of allowance and say even the people that we portray didn't always have the answer, and that's okay. Now, if it is something that your guy would absolutely know, then you can find a creative way to say I don't know, or you can just come right out and say I don't know. It's not always, there's sometimes, it's the three most difficult words to say as an interpreter. But honesty and transparency, I think, is probably very important in this job, as the audience expects you to give them honesty and expects you to give them facts. And if there is dishonesty, I think, presented, then suddenly walls begin to come up, and there are deeper questions about, is any of the material real or factual? And that's a pretty dangerous place to be. So, it's not easy to say I don't know, but you can find a creative way in character to say I don't know. Sometimes, like for example, I was asked not so distantly a question about a letter that Jefferson had written, and the man, we have 22,500 of his letters, and I don't have them all in my head. And so, you know what I did? I said almost exactly that. I said, I've written 22,500 letters, and I can't remember them all. But I'll go back into my records, which Jefferson kept, and find out the answer. So you can find a creative and honest way to say, I don't know.
We have a question from Kate, who asks, how do you balance portraying a historical figure when folks want to see you through a modern lens? Perhaps that idea of a contemporary audience wanting to view a historical figure from one perspective or another.
Oh, well, yeah. You try your best to present all facets. You try your best to balance the scale and present the human. Jefferson, some people, and rightly so, come to Jefferson with some axes to grind and only view him through one lens. I'm not saying that's a lens we should not view him from. We should. But no one, spills out a 1,000-piece puzzle in front of the table before them, picks up one piece and says, I've got the whole thing. If you want the whole picture, then we need to digest the whole picture. So sometimes if I get an audience member with a clear path, I try to, in my answer, balance the path with the other side of the scale, whatever side that is. And the hope is to present the human. He was flawed. Jefferson talks about his flaws. He's pretty honest about it, actually, which is kind of admirable. So if I can present that to you or to a guest who has a certain view or lens, then maybe I can get some wheels to turn in a way that creates an allowance of acceptance of a larger human rather than just being known for one thing. And this happens on both the positive side, I'll say, and the negative side. Some people think of Jefferson as a deified American god, and sometimes it's my then job to balance the scale a little bit.
Claudia asks, how did you figure out the balance between portraying Jefferson as a historical figure while still being able to see the man behind that edifice?
Yeah, well, I would say that's a work in progress. I think you constantly have to check in. One of the pitfalls of this job is that we grow close, and we grow close to the people that we portray, even so close that we might begin to unsee some things that we first saw because we begin to lift them up on the pedestal that history has created for them. So you're exactly right. You have to check yourself, and it's good to constantly sort of check in and say, am I being honest right now? And I'll be honest with you, there are some audiences I have left, and in replaying the conversations in my head, I think, I presented Jefferson in a pretty positive light with that answer, and I probably should have balanced the scales a bit and given a more holistic answer. So I think the answer is in being honest with yourself, constantly checking in and saying, am I deifying this person, or am I really presenting an honest picture? Now, the fortunate thing for Jefferson is if I ever get my head too big and my ego too large about Jefferson, there's a whole lot of books that'll bring me down. You don't have to search far for biographers that don't treat him very lightly. So, and some of those exist on my bookshelves, and I'll read them. So I try to, balance my intake of information as well. It's not all Jefferson, glorified Jefferson. I read what the other side has to say, and gives me, hopefully, a better balance as well? That's a fantastic question.
We've had several individuals ask or observe about the humor or levity that you'll inject into your interpretation as Jefferson. How did you come to make that choice in your interpretation?
Yeah, Jefferson, he's not as stodgy and dusty and old and tired as some people would believe. If you read as much Jefferson material as I do, you begin to see the jokes, and he makes jokes. But I will say, I didn't begin to pick up on Jefferson humor until probably, 5,000, 6,000 or so letters in. I really began to pick up on his brand of humor. His humor tends to be pretty buried in some erudite material, but he does make puns, for example. He makes puns to the Marquis de Lafayette. He makes puns to James Madison. It should also be said he doesn't make puns to people who he doesn't have a pretty close relationship with. But when you begin to pull out these letters between Lafayette and Jefferson and Madison and Jefferson, and these puns start lifting themselves out, you begin to then see Jefferson in a new light and allow for some humor in your public audience, which is what I do. I also use humor, I'll be honest. I use a little bit more humor probably than Jefferson would in a public audience. And I do have regular conversation and check-ins with myself. Am I using too much humor? I use humor from an artistic point, but I use 18th century authentic Jefferson humor that I then lift out and sometimes twist slightly to a modern ear. But I use it from a dramatic standpoint. If I've been talking too long about one subject and I can feel the energy drag, then I'll drop something in to perk people up, and then we can keep going. Especially in the hot months, this becomes pretty useful. There's a comedian who says when he's talking about philosophy in his stand-up routine, he likes to make people laugh because when their mouth is open, he drops something in for them to really chew on. And I think that's probably a pretty good way to think about Jefferson and humor in my public audiences. I like to laugh.
Barbara asks a question that we could probably host an entire symposium here at Colonial Williamsburg on and still not cover everything. How do you explain Jefferson's complicated views in regards to slavery?
Oh, Barbara, yes, that is a symposium, and there has much been written about it. So, how do you explain his complicated views? I think first and foremost, you have to understand that he's human. And I say you have to understand, but I mean, sometimes we forget that these guys were human. We have so polished them and literally etched them in marble and lifted them up on pedestals and made them literally larger than life that their feet no longer touch the ground. And we are surprised then when these American gods make a mistake. I think we do a disservice to our generation when we say things like, wasn't that a great generation, the founding generation? That generation will never live again, never happen again. We take power from ourselves when we give all the power to them and don't give allowance for us to do the exact same greatness, extend the exact same greatness upon society, and also engage in the same faults. Jefferson's contemplative nature around slavery is one of these. We're bicameral beings. We have two spheres, and Jefferson tends to do that with slavery. He sometimes bobbles this thing and juggles it back and forth in a bicameral nature. I will say, in my reading of Jefferson, I have no doubt that Jefferson wanted to end slavery. And we can get into this. This is part of the symposium that we're now going to have. Welcome to a 16-and-a-half-hour symposium. You thought it started at 2 and ended at 3. Congratulations. This thing's going until 2 in the morning. Jefferson clearly, in my view, wanted to end slavery. It's all over his public works, not just his internal writings and private letters. The man tried to end it multiple times, mitigate it multiple times, constrain it, restrain it, erode it. It never really took entirely. The closest he got was a passage of Bill 51 here, in fact. But did Jefferson sometimes wonder if the African was different physiologically than the European? The answer is yes. And when we begin to create a distinction physiologically, scientifically, between two races, well, then suddenly they become less like two races and more like two species, and we would never give our dogs or our horses the same rights that we give us humans. It becomes a bit easier, this dehumanization. It becomes a bit easier to then create laws and systems ever tightening the noose and perfecting that institution of slavery. This is a total symposium. Come to Colonial Williamsburg. We can continue to have this conversation, not just with me, but we have a beautiful, lovely, brilliant African-American interpretive department, and they visit this issue every single day. So you don't just have to listen to a white man talk about it, although that's complicated and extremely interesting. We portray every facet of 18th century life here.
We've got so many questions, and we're so short on time. How do you feel about a lightning round?
Let's do it. Lightning round. What do we, 30 seconds an answer?
Sure. From Caroline, she asks, how often do you change your presentation?
How often do I change my presentation? We're sort of constantly creating new presentations, Caroline. So last year I created a pretty cool piece that I'm excited about called Pursuing Happiness, but I have general sort of Jefferson 101 presentations, and Caroline, I change that thing every single time I do it. It's all almost at this point extemporaneous, and I literally will set a topic in a year at the front end as I'm walking on stage, and then run through it and then answer questions. So that thing is different every single time.
From Kay, she asks, what room are you in right now, and what might Jefferson have done there?
We are in the House of Burgesses, the hob of the Capitol building in Colonial Williamsburg. This was the capital. The city was the capital in colonial times, post-Jamestown, of course, and entering post-independence. This was also the capital. And this building is the Capitol building, houses three branches of government, as you know them, as they're just the same. Executive, legislative, and judicial. This is the legislative room. The House of Burgesses are elected representatives, and Jefferson was an elected representative and set in this reconstructed Capitol building. He represented Albemarle County. Was that 30 seconds?
Dawn inquires, what has been your favorite Jefferson quote to use in your interpretations?
Malo periculosum libertatum quam quietum servitutum. Thank you, Dawn.
That one, we've still got some time left on that
one.
Oh,
okay. So Jefferson writes this. He's always switching languages in his letters, which is a joy. He'll switch from Greek, Latin, English. Whatever language fits the phrase that he wants to use, he'll use that language. The man was quite erudite, spoke and wrote 7 languages. It means I would take a tumultuous liberty over a peaceful slavery. Pretty cool.
Lauren inquires, do you sometimes think you are Jefferson when you're not at your job?
Yes, Lauren, my wife would tell you to put she would tell you that sometimes she tells me to put Jefferson away. She'd like to speak with her husband for a while. So there's always 2 men in my head at any one moment. It does become a little bit difficult. You absorb so much material from one person. It's kind of hard to stop those wheels. Easy to take the clothes off and the hat off. A bit more difficult to sometimes switch back into your real person.
Sarah inquires, who is your favorite nation builder to have a conversation with in character?
Ooh, my favorite nation builder to have a conversation with in character. That's not a sticky question.
This might be one of your colleagues using a pseudonym.
Yeah, one of my colleagues. Well, let's see if we can get this one right. All of them. How PC and equitable is that? I will say it is easier sometimes to talk as Jefferson with some other nation builders than it is with others, and that's just based on the relationships that they had. An easy one is James Madison. The guys were hashtag America's first bromance. You know, they wrote thousands of letters to each other. So shout out to J. Mad.
One last lightning round question. How many from Kimberly? How many outfits do you have for Thomas Jefferson?
Ooh, Kimberly, I don't know. I have a lot. I wear this. Colonial Williamsburg does a fantastic job of not just making sure you have the right material and that you're prepped mentally, but also that you're wearing accurately down to the stitch. If you've seen John Trumbull's painting of the Continental Congress in '76, well, you see Jefferson dressed in a suit a lot like this. It's navy blue. It's got some buttons that do absolutely nothing because gentry. He's got a red waistcoat, and you know the red waistcoat, I was talking about the memorandum books here. Jefferson has listed several times in his memorandum books that he buys red cloth or scarlet cloth, and he even says specifically for waistcoats. So I've got a lot of red waistcoats, and this is accounted for in primary source material. If you saw me walking down the street, you might not know that, but we are as accurate as we can be down to the very stitch. I've got a lot of costumes. I don't know, if I had to guess, maybe 12 different full suits. I've got a velvet suit based on a Jefferson portrait, the earliest portrait by Brown. If you want to look that one up, he's got powdered hair. He's looking very fancy because he's in Paris.
And that's all the time we have for questions
today. That's all the time. Well, friends, thank you for joining us. If we didn't get to your question, I'm sorry, but we'll do our best next time. You can always, as soon as our doors open back up, come and speak with us. We're happy to take you and receive you in personal conversation whenever you feel safe and when the foundation opens its doors again to you. Thank you for coming here today. Thank you for having this brave conversation. Thank you for entering into brave conversation. This is something that Colonial Williamsburg does every single day of the year. You know, we talk here about all of the things that you're not supposed to speak of during Thanksgiving dinner. We talk about slavery and religion and education and states' rights versus federal rights, and we do so at Colonial Williamsburg. We have the uncanny ability to have heightened, enlightened conversation and even have a difference of opinion, but still remain friends. And isn't that so desperately what this country needs? So if you find yourself needing this, if you find yourself needing a Northern Star, if you need something to clear away some muddy waters in 2020 and beyond, what better place to come for clarity, for truth, for fact, and understanding of our history bringing us to the present than right here at Colonial Williamsburg. And until our doors open again, you can continue to meet with us through the power of great physic electrique. Thank you, Dr. Franklin. In fact, tomorrow at 2 p.m., we're going to have a lovely conversation on the Facebook live stream, just like we are today, but not with me, with two of our theatrical interpreters, Alex and Claire. And they'll be presenting some beautiful material for you tomorrow, so stay tuned. As always, this is a private foundation. It is only made possible through your generous donations, the donations of our donor base and future donors and viewers just like you. So if you can, put a penny in the pot, and we'll keep this thing rolling for you in 2020 and beyond. Until then, Kurt Smith and Thomas Jefferson, signing off.